Hey, beautiful people. My name is Kristen. Thank you for stopping by my channel. Today, I want to share a little bit about some books and kind of a trip and experience even as I explore Black History Month, civil rights movements. I did recently this month go to Birmingham, Alabama for a week-long conference. There was one day that we got as our free day that we actually were touring all of the museums and parks and monuments around Birmingham, went to the 6th Street Bridge, which was the 60th anniversary of the bombing, where the 4 young girls passed away in a terrible, terrible act of racial hatred. And it feels on one hand like that was ancient history. And honestly, if you yourself are 60 or know somebody who's 60 or older, they were alive when that happened. So it's not that long ago. So there's something still to definitely be learned about reading and exploring and, taking in this part of history. So for the month of February, I did read Harriett Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. I had never read this before. It's a pretty thick book for a classic, but it goes into in-depth stories of the slaves and their treatment on the plantations, their treatment of the families, particularly focused on that aspect of family, about families continuously being separated, being taken apart, being sold, treated, really worse than property in a lot of ways. And just the hurting your heart kind of truth and reality that this brought. I've always learned in textbooks so many references and talking about this and about how it really was one of the first books that deeply opened people's eyes and started a lot of discussion and trouble. And I think even the beginning, Abraham Lincoln was like, oh, so this is the reason why, this is the cause of this trouble kind of thing. It's like sometimes when we speak truth, it can cause some issues, right? So it's really, really critically important when it's those hard truths that truth is spoken in love, that truth is spoken gently and with room to receive the pain. Because this is a very painful part of our history, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't address it or read it. And I really feel like I wish, and not that I would have wanted to have read the whole book, because if I had been forced to read such a book, especially the length, it wouldn't have hit me. But one story or one section, I think would have been a really wise choice. I understand and appreciate, hey, what you would want to shelter people in some sense, but I think you can make it age appropriate. And certainly by middle school and high school, this should be included in the history. Along with that, I read On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed. This is a very short book in comparison. It's a memoir of a woman who grows up in Texas, which I also grew up in Texas. And I learned very recently that Juneteenth, that we now celebrate on June 19th, the freedom and the proclamation of no more slavery, that June 19th, the last state kind of to declare it, which made it totally the end, was Texas, and specifically on Galveston. And so there's a real connection and there's a real angst, like we were just talking about this book having hard history and the horrors of slavery, and then being a Texan and going, well, Texas was the last holdout. Texas was the one who fought against freeing the slaves longer than any other state. And though I can appreciate why kind of at that point, the final frontier, the last frontier, now it's Alaska, which I also lived in, by the way, but I must be a last frontier kind of spirit. However, that doesn't excuse us from facing needing to deal with things, because Texans are tough, y'all. We are tough. So I think as a tough Texan that we can deal with the realities of history. What individuals make of it, that's up to the individuals. The author, Annette, she was a young Black woman growing up in Texas, and her perspective throughout the book of how history was taught. And she was like, I was never taught about the extent of slaves in Texas and how slaves were actually brought here in mass quantity to clear the land, to establish the cities, to help work the fields. Specifically, Stephen F. Austin, the founder of Texas, worked with Mexico because the land was governed by Mexico at that time, and got permission to bring slaves because Mexico was an anti-slave country. And so they had to do this in order to have enough labor to settle the wildness and the harshness that was the Texas terrain. And it probably, is going to happen eventually, but it happened much, much faster because a bunch of human slaves were brought and forced to work. And that reality and that history is very much downplayed. And I was particularly struck by Annette's beautiful story about how, we're told this happened and it's a passing mention, but we don't need to remember that, or we don't need to hold on to that. And yet Texas is all about its history, and remember the Alamo and remember Goliad. And I do wish, as a person who also grew up, that I had that fullness. I think I could have handled having the full story and having the truth and dealing with that. And I think that would help us as individuals as we grow and learn and shape how we even look at those around us on a daily basis. But this book is just a blessing. Brian over at Bookish recommended it to me. I'm going to link his channel below, because that is a place that if you are interested in this topic, he has multiple videos on reviews, talking, and also just talks about racism and the state of that process. And being kind of a background teacher, history buff, way more than it's a great resource. So I highly recommend this if you have any interest in that kind of backstory and history. And then finally, kind of jumping back to my Alabama trip, I was blessed to meet the author, the Reverend Micheal Waters, who is most famous for writing for Beautiful Black Boys Who Believe in a Better World. This is a children's illustrated book that tells the story of his son, Jeremiah, who was exposed to a lot of the injustices and killing. His dad, being a preacher, would go and speak and kind of do the eulogies. I think this is a vigil for a young man who was killed unjustly, and Jeremiah would come to him and be like, who died now? And just the reality that when your dad's a preacher and he's dressed for a funeral, and it happens so often that a young child is just like, who died now? That again goes to that heartbreaking reality, there is something wrong, there is something messed up. And Jeremiah is a teenager now. So this is definitely not ancient history, and this is definitely still going on and a struggle. And he also wrote another book, Liberty's Civil Rights Road Trip. And this book, he read it to us and shared with us that story of the different main stops on the civil rights freedom riders and all of that kind of goodness, kind of ending at the bridge at Selma, and telling those stories, and some of which I had not heard. And just that deep sense of history when I went myself to the 6th Street Sixth Street Church and got the tour and stood in the place where the bomb had gone off. And then across the street is a park, and there was a gentleman there who went by barbershop, and he sang us his kind of story and homage of being there as a 7-year-old boy. And they actually had the children march because the adults could be jailed or fined, and they started jailing the kids and sicking dogs and fire hoses on children. And just, he had those stories. He had a scar where a dog had bit him. And, you know, some of my group were like, oh, I don't know if that's totally, you know, happened to him. But regardless, if even it did or not to him specifically, it is his story. It did happen. These are the realities of people who are still alive today, and we have to be real about that. We have to say, gosh, that was wrong. That was a painful chapter in our history. And we also have to recognize that not everybody, we can't group all people. You can't say all the Germans were Nazis, because we know story after story of German people who were hiding the Jews and doing the right thing. But it's hard, right? The people who are making the difference are sometimes those that also get caught in the crossfire. So there is still a story going on. There is still a message to go. And it's just part of our responsibility, I think, as all of us, to continue to read, to educate ourselves. And there's some joy in it too. It's not all a Debbie Downer kind of thing. There is just a fullness of hope, a fullness of the progress, a fullness of the redemption and the restoration that has been achieved so far. And we get to be part of that story, to take one more step towards it, one more step towards truly having equality and humanity across the board. So I want to leave you with Reverend Micheal Waters' own words as he reads from a excerpt of one of his books that he blessed us with as a sending out poem. So here it is for you. Blessings on your day. Thank you so much for stopping by.
It's entitled Today. Today I watched black and brown children at play in a park, where years before, young children were met by fire hoses and canines, across from where 4 little girls died at church from a bomb, down the street from where a little boy was shot in the back by police the same day. And though knowing in America today, black and brown children are still shot by police in parks, Tamir Rice, say his name. And though knowing bans and threats of a wall descend upon brown people, separating brown children from their families, I am grateful that the arc still bends towards justice if you have the courage to bend it. Amen.